Today, I'm going to be talking to you about my very favorite topic in technology, which is accessibility. So just quick show of hands, who's ever gone through the process of making your application accessible? Good. Yeah, that's like half of you. That's awesome. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about. We're not going to, a lot of my talks, I do deep dives. I go really deep into the APIs and we start kind of crunching a lot of code. I'm not going to do that today. This talk is much more about what you can do that's quick and easy to take an app from not accessible to pretty darn good. Because I think most of the time that's what we really need. It's not necessarily, oh, I need to solve this one really deep problem, as much as it is, let's just figure out this little thing. So before I start, just a little bit about me, since I'm not from here, you probably don't know about me. I'm currently a freelance iOS developer. Previously, I worked at a little fitness startup called Chorus. Before that, I was at Twitter, and before that, I was at Apple. I'm also, if you've read my bio, I'm an aerial circus performer and a coach. So that's my second life, and people often think that's a joke, but it's not. That's me. It's actually what I do when I'm not doing this. So obviously, because of that, I'm a health and fitness lover. Garmin watches, Fitbit trackers, Apple Watch, whatever it is. Like I try it all. I just all my favorite kind of stuff. And of course, most importantly, why we're here today, I am an accessibility engineer and an advocate. And actually, tomorrow I'm speaking at an accessibility conference, also in Stockholm. Different talk though. It's one of those technical deep dive ones. So let's get started with the actual topic. So for those of you who haven't dealt with accessibility much, I always like to start here with what is accessibility, because we need to answer that before we can start talking more. I really like Apple's definition more than almost any other I've encountered. Accessibility means using technology to overcome challenges. And the reason I like that is because of the word challenges. It's not specifically pointing out disability, but really any challenge that anyone might face. So what might these challenges be? Now, these challenges could be visual. Now, this could mean someone is completely blind. That's probably what we most commonly think of when we think of accessibility. But this could also be you driving a car, a car or a vehicle, flying a plane, and at the same time, you want to use your phone, but you can't really look at it. So you might have a motor challenge. Now, this could be, again, something lifelong, a big struggle like cerebral palsy. But maybe you just went skiing and you broke your hand, and now using your phone has become really difficult. Now, these could be auditory challenges. So, of course, a person could be deaf or hard of hearing, but maybe you're just using your phone without the audio turned on, maybe during a presentation at a meetup. Okay. And these challenges could also be learning or cognitive challenges. So, of course, someone could be born with a learning disability or perhaps autism. But maybe someone is just a young child or an elderly adult, and the challenge isn't that anything is particularly wrong, quote unquote, but just that they're at a different stage in their learning with technology. So what you'll notice with each of these examples is that, of course, it can be a disability that we're talking about in the more traditional sense, or it can really just be a challenge that you or I might face any given day. So accessibility is really for absolutely everyone. I like to use this comic to illustrate it, and I'm going to read it aloud because that is making it more accessible. So we see a student in a wheelchair, and the student is asking, could you please shovel the ramp to the school? And perhaps the super is saying, well, all of these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then we'll clear the ramp for you. And the student in the wheelchair responds, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. And to me, this is illustrating really what one of the key benefits of accessibility is when something becomes accessible to some people, it actually becomes accessible to almost everyone. It improves the path forward for everyone, and it makes all of our apps easier to use. So I'd like you to see some assistive technology in action rather than me just talking about it. So in this video, you'll meet Haben Girma. Haben is an attorney who happens to be deaf-blind. She is an absolutely amazing woman and is the first deaf-blind person to graduate from Harvard Law School. In this video, you'll also notice that there is a voiceover track playing in the video itself. This itself is its own assistive technology, and it's providing audio descriptions of what you see on the screen so that if someone here has a visual disability, they can still watch the video by hearing it. So let's hear what Haben has to say.
Haben Germa is wearing a red dress with a braille keyboard resting on her lap as she sits across from BuzzFeed News video producer Alison Luckian, who has a little table with a QWERTY keyboard placed in front of her.
My name is Haben Germa, and I'm trained as an attorney. I'm a non-traditional lawyer in that I focus on teaching companies and organizations, schools, nonprofits to see the value of disability inclusion.
Haben talks towards Allison's direction. Behind her is a view of City Hall in San Francisco.
A lot of people have misconceptions about disability, so I help teach them and help advocate for greater access for the disability community.
Haben is talking to camera.
I have 2 braille displays out right now just so we can do the demo.
Cut back to shot of Haben smiling and as Allison types on QWERTY keyboard.
I said interesting. Can you tell me how it feels?
I could also let you feel it.
Allison types how that works too. Haben smiling turns her braille keyboard around in Allison's direction. Allison inches her way towards the edge of her seat to get closer to the keyboard. Cut to a shot of the braille keyboard as Allison types on the QWERTY keyboard.
Oh, cool. So when I type, there's little pigs on there that's moving.
Cut to a shot of Haben's hands as her right finger schemes across the cursor keys on the braille keyboard.
So keyboard at the top for typing data, not cursor keys. They're navigation thumb keys on the bottom. They're connected through Bluetooth.
We see Haben's iPhone next to the braille keyboard connected by Bluetooth.
Everything on the screen appears in braille. I'm navigating using voiceover hand gestures on the phone, and whatever's on the phone shows up in digital braille.
Haben talking to Allison.
With haptics, I get a buzz when I get a message, because I wouldn't have my phone on me because I like wearing dresses and don't have pockets, but I could still stay connected and know when someone's trying to get my attention.
We see Haben's iPhone next to the braille keyboard.
I think this will encourage more people to make their apps accessible and their videos and pictures accessible.
We see a video post from Haben's Instagram. Haben and Maxine are standing in front of a 1911 steam train.
Captions help deaf individuals access videos.
Instagram post of Haben on blue paddleboard. She's holding a tall paddle in both hands. Behind her is a beach with large sand-colored houses.
And image descriptions help blind individuals access pictures.
Instagram post. Haben is reading from a braille display connected to her MacBook Air. Behind her is a grassy field with soccer nets and trees.
So when you post videos, add captions, add audio descriptions.
Haben back in interview room talking to camera.
And add image descriptions for your photos so everyone can access your story.
All right. So as you saw, Haben uses the built-in screen reader on her iOS device to read her screen to her and to send information to her braille display. So when you are making things accessible, you're not only just interacting with something like VoiceOver, but that VoiceOver can be propagated out to braille. So there's so many kind of different ways that this can be used by an individual. So my goal today is that you will walk away with real and actionable advice or tips that you can implement tomorrow to make your applications more accessible for people like Haben. And in this talk, in order to do that, we're going to cover 10 lightweight tips that will essentially let you make your app more accessible with maybe 5 minutes of work. You'll see that accessibility is not too hard. It doesn't have to take a ton of time. So without further ado, let's get into the tips and see what we can do. So first of all, have high color contrast ratios. So what do I mean by that? So the color contrast ratio that I'm talking about is a foreground color to a background color, and it's computed with a little formula. So here on the screen, we can see a silly little demo app and 2 different versions of it. We see a pink background and more of a purple eggplant background. And I think probably for most people in the room, especially people in the back, it's pretty clear that it's easier to read the one with the darker background, the white text on the dark background. And that one has a higher color contrast ratio. So minimum color contrasts we want are 4.5 to 1 for normal text and 3 to 1 for large text. And large text is anything that's 14 point bold or 18 point. So how do we check that? If you Google color contrast checker, you'll find tons of these tools all over the internet. The one that I like to use is particularly great because it actually checks to see if you conform to the Web Content Guideline standards, which are also generally good practices for mobile developers. So you can see here that if we take the first screen with the pink background and we plug in the 2 different colors to this checker, it fails all the tests And we get a color contrast ratio of 1.9, which is obviously below what the goal we set for ourselves here. And if we plug in the values from our other screen, we get great ratios. We get 7:1, and that's more than accessible by all the different standards. So why do these color contrast ratios matter besides, oh, well, I can see that better? Well, I can see that better is a huge reason, actually. 7 to 12% of men have some form of color blindness, and a much lower percentage of women also. So color blindness, of course, is going to be impacted by these ratios will impact people with color blindness, clearly. There's other issues, things like macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, cataracts, retinitis pigmentosa. All of these things can lower your quality of vision. So anything to raise that contrast is going to be really helpful for those people. And finally, sometimes we just have imperfect viewing conditions. If the sunlight is really bright, your eyes are tired, you just went to the eye doctor, there can be many reasons why your vision just isn't so sharp right now. And having a high color contrast ratio is going to help you. Additionally, high contrast ratios will play well when users use the display settings on their devices. So your iOS device has many display settings. You can invert colors, you can go to grayscale, and many more things, color filters, etc. And higher contrasts, generally speaking, are going to work much better with any of these settings than if I have a lot of similar colors that will blend together when we move over to grayscale. So there's number one. Let's go to number two. Use dynamic type and auto layout. So why do I do that? So let's look at how Apple does it, and then we'll see kind of how we can apply it to ourselves. So here's the Health app. And this is probably what it looks like on all of our phones, most likely if we open up the app. But if we go into our accessibility settings and we decide we want much larger text, we go in and we configure that setting, hop back out, we go back to the Health app, it's going to look like this. It's going to look quite different. You'll notice that the fonts have automatically adapted in size, and auto layout within the text cells has allowed them to wrap where appropriate. You'll notice also that the collection view layout itself has kind of re-managed and had its cells resized. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, Apple's using dynamic type to doing two things. Whenever a font is set, instead of using system font of size, which is what we're kind of used to using, they're using preferred font for text style. This makes fonts dynamic based on the system's device settings, which are controlled primarily through accessibility. To make UI labels, text views, etc., this is going to make them adjust the font size while if the change happens in the background. But we also want to make sure that the font size can be adjusted when the app is running. So in order to do that, we make sure that adjusts font for content size category is set to true for UI label, UI text field, UI text view. So by doing those two things, essentially setting a bool and getting your fonts from a different source from UI font, that is all it takes to use dynamic type. In the second screenshot we saw, we noticed that the text is wrapping, it can be multi-line. And this is done, of course, using auto layout so that any container that is holding text can easily support this kind of wrapping. And finally, by checking the preferred content size category on UI application, the application can use different layouts where necessary. And this is how we're getting that different layout with the different cell sizes. Now, obviously, that last one does take more work. That's not necessarily a 5-minute change to have two different layouts. But everything else, using dynamic type and more generally just using auto layout, is generally just a best practice from the very beginning. So why does all of this matter? So generally, I like to think of an app as a content provider. You, as the developer, I'm providing content via an application, and that's how the users are getting it. However, it's up to my user how he or she wants to actually consume the content. Maybe my user wants to hear my content via audio. Maybe they want to consume my content via Braille. Maybe they want my content with massive text. So that is all up to my user. My job is just to make sure that that content coming through the app can get through to them the best way possible, however that user chooses. So of course, the users that can benefit are going to be our low vision users because they can crank that font size up, or maybe elderly users because they often will also have maybe visual challenges. But really, any user who has a text size preference should be able to have that preference showing through your application. So, next thing, number 3. Don't make people tap tiny things. No one wants to tap tiny things. So, let's use a silly example first. Always start with the silly example. So we see, this is from another conference I went to not too long ago. And this is a silly little demo app that you could rate a talk. And it could be, happy, sad, neutral, or angry. Hopefully this is not making anyone angry. And you can see pretty obvious here, right? We see little faces or we see big faces. And probably also seems obvious that the one with big faces, probably easier to tap, probably less likely you're going to make a mistake picking the face. Generally speaking, we want our tap targets to be at least 44 points by 44 points. That's about 9 millimeters squared. And the reason 9 millimeters is the number is because that's approximately the size of a human fingertip. And we also want to make sure that tap targets are well spaced. The general rule there is about 32 points apart. So I think the why on this one's probably pretty obvious. Of course, with low vision users, tiny tap targets are going to be challenging. Also, this one is particularly important for motor impairments. So cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, ALS, any of these things can cause tremors or shaking of the hands. Of course, it's going to be a lot more likely to make a mistake if your hand is shaking and you're trying to tap something very, very tiny. But of course, if you're just using your other hand because you broke one, you can have a very similar issue. And if the targets are very small, you can also just end up missing completely, which can become very frustrating to users if they can't tell if they've tapped something or not. And seriously, have you ever tried to tap the username of someone who liked your picture on Instagram? That never goes well. I always end up going somewhere else, sending a direct message or something. So this actually applies for absolutely everyone. Tapping tiny things is frustrating. All right, tip number 4. Use standard UIKIT components whenever possible. What does that mean? So let's say that your designer hands you a thing, and it's almost a UI tab bar, almost, but you start to implement it, and darn it, there's this one thing you just can't customize with UI tab bar's appearance settings. So, all right, it's time to build your My Startup tab bar view controller from scratch. It's going to be really fun. You're going to open source it. It's going to be great. Or maybe you just are like, you know what? Apple sliders are boring. Switches are boring. I'm building my own stuff. And I'm here to probably sadly tell you, please don't do that. Or at least do it very carefully. And I'll explain what I mean by very carefully in just a second. So why? Why shouldn't you just make everything new and pretty? The thing is that UIKit provides a lot of accessibility for free. So just by using stock parts, you get a lot that you don't have to do. So controls, for example, they always are going to have the correct traits. So that the system will know what to tell the user. It'll tell them that a button's a button. It will tell them what state an off and on toggle is in. It'll tell them where a slider is at between two different values. That comes for free when you're just using Apple stuff. Navigation also has a lot that comes for free. So there's special voiceover gestures that screen reader users will use on the screen. Things like a back gesture. And that back gesture comes for free if I use the navigation controller. Finally, users who rely on assistive technology in their devices are often very used to the things that come for free, these certain words that VoiceOver says, certain gestures that are supported. And if you kind of change everything up on them, that can become a frustrating experience. So in the end, if you do build your own UI component, the one thing I will say is you want to make sure it is as accessible as the Apple version. So you might be like, well, that's great, Sommer, but we have to build our own. We're building our own stuff. And I understand that sometimes that's just how it has to be. So in that case, do the research. Spend some time with the Apple component. If you're building your own tab bar controller, sit down with the tab bar controller. Work with it with VoiceOver on. Work with it with a switch on. Look at it with different font size settings. See how it behaves and make sure that you try to bring all those behaviors to your version of it. Because in the end, that's going to serve your users best. All right. Number 5, communicate important information in multiple modes. So what does that one mean? That one probably sounds a little more complex, but it's really not. So here's another little silly demo app. Always again. This one, I'm filling out a user info form, giving them my name and my phone number. And I type my phone number wrong. I leave a digit off. And so the app is going to let me know that. So here, it lets me know one way. It changes the color of the phone number. So I hit submit, phone number changed color. So that's one mode of communication to me. Now let's make this better because we said multiple. So now I'm going to do something else. I'm going to add content. So now I'm going to have a content change, also signifying what's wrong. So now my screen has invalid phone number underneath the text field. So now I have a color change and a content change. I'm going to do one better now. I'm going to add voiceover. So if the user is using a screen reader, the voiceover will actually announce unable to submit invalid phone number. So now we have 3 modes of communication. So why did I do this? Well, we don't know the best way to communicate with our users. Now we saw a color change. Well, the color change works great if I can see color. But if my vision's not so great, or perhaps I'm colorblind, color change isn't going to be enough. Now adding content, that's pretty good. That's going to work for almost anyone who can see, but not necessarily everyone can see. So yes, a screen reader would be able to find that content, but unless you direct the screen reader to the content once it shows up, that's still not going to be enough. And so adding that third layer, that voiceover announcement, that's an auditory guarantee that it's going to get through to the user. So the more modes we have, the more likely we are to get that information to our user in a timely manner, whether it's through visual means, audio means, color, placement. So when we need to communicate important info, we want to use mini modes. In other words, we want to pair things. Auditory with visual. With visual, we want to use color and placement and content. Another great way to signal things to users is haptics. Now that we can make things vibrate and buzz, that's an awesome way. We saw Haben talk about it, actually. She loves the haptics, and that's very common with the visually impaired community, that haptics are very useful. And as we saw before, announcing things via voiceover, that's just a one-liner in your code, UI accessibility post notification. And you just put in the string localized that you want to be spoken, and that will be only run when voiceover is turned on. So many ways to communicate to our users when something's important. Okay, number 6, we've crossed that halfway point threshold. Images are images, text is text. This one's a bit of a tautology, but it's very important. So depending on the type of application you're writing, it can be tempting to create fancy text as image assets. So these will be shown as a UI image rather than being a UI label. And you might think, oh, I would never do this, but it's more common than you think. It's often done with headers. It's often done with buttons. And especially you'll see this a lot in games and children's apps. So good way to think about images is images are generally kind of in one of 3 categories. They're either provided by your users, so something like Instagram or Twitter, where the users are putting images in your service. The image is something you're providing to convey information. So this would be something like on your tab bar, you have a little email icon, whatever it is. And images can be decorative. So if we think about a logo sitting up in the corner of your application that kind of always hangs out there, those are the 3 main categories that images can live in. And you'll notice none of these say have text because they shouldn't. They should not contain text. So why? Why shouldn't they? Is it that big of a deal? Well, first of all, VoiceOver can't read text from UI images. And additionally, unless you provide different assets for different content modes, then if you followed tip 1, dynamic text size, your images aren't going to dynamically resize. So dynamic text size doesn't work if your text is in image form. And lastly, localization, which is kind of a sister issue to accessibility, becomes harder when you have your text inside of images. So for all of these reasons, but particularly for the sizing and for VoiceOver, when it comes to an accessibility perspective, it's important to make sure all of our text is text. All right. We've talked a lot about VoiceOver, but we haven't actually had a tip that really truly involved it. But here it is. Tip number 7, test with VoiceOver. So what is testing with VoiceOver? What does that look like? Well, you probably need to know how to use your phone with VoiceOver running in order to do that. So to best understand that, rather than watching me use my phone, probably not as useful for you, I'd like to introduce you to Tommy Edison. So he's a fantastic YouTuber and film critic, and he happens to also be blind. If you ever are really interested in just the life of a blind person, especially one who interacts with a lot of technology, I highly recommend his YouTube channel. He does great things like what is color for a blind person, for example. So really cool little 3-minute videos. Today, he's going to show us on a very old version of Twitter how to use VoiceOver on an iPhone. But everything he's showing you today still applies now.
So each thing,
Double tap to open.
touch it once, it tells you what it is, twice to perform the action.
Notes. Maps. Stocks. YouTube.
And then to move to the different screens, 3 fingers to go left like this.
Page 2 of 4. Game Center.
So let me show you how some of this stuff works.
Twitter. Double tap to open.
So let's. All right, so let's see what's going on in the Twitter universe today.
Chris Boyles. For those watching Love Machine, the girl next to me is actually 8 foot tall, which is why I look short.
Why don't I tweet something?
What new tweet? Button. Text field is editing.
All right, so when I tweet, I generally cheat and use Siri. It's easier that way.
Dictate.
Happy Easter, comma, from the blind film critic.
Happy Easter from the blind film critic.
See, pretty innocuous, nice little tweet. So let's put it up.
Tweet button.
All right. So all the gestures you saw, that's all still true today. 3-finger swipes, scrolling around with 1 finger, double tapping to activate. Since this video was shot, Apple has added a lot more to VoiceOver, but the key things we want to support, we already got to see. So turning on VoiceOver is obviously step 1. Settings, general, accessibility, VoiceOver. Once you go into VoiceOver, though, you'll notice there's an on and off switch, of course. But then there's so many settings, more than you probably ever realized possible. So it's very fun to start to play with those settings and just kind of get a better understanding for how this can be used. What I definitely recommend doing, though, to make yourself a better accessibility tester is turning on your accessibility shortcut. And that is done via accessibility shortcut. That's going to be a triple tap on your Siri button or your home button, depending on the type of iPhone you have. And then you can select whatever accessibility services you want quickly available via that shortcut. Now with the newest version of iOS, you can also put it in Control Center. So you can also get to turn on VoiceOver quickly from Control Center as well. So once you've got VoiceOver running, of course, then you'll need to use it. So sliding or swiping your finger will move the cursor. Double tapping will select whatever the cursor is highlighting. And 3 fingers will do the scrolling. If you want to learn more gestures and get better practice with VoiceOver, once you get to VoiceOver in the settings, and you turn it on, a little row will appear right under the on and off button that says VoiceOver Practice. If you do the VoiceOver Practice, it'll teach you even more about how to use VoiceOver. It exists on your iOS devices. There's also a VoiceOver Practice on Mac if you're interested in how VoiceOver works on Mac. So once you've got it running and you've got your app, what are you going to test? So the big things that I like to kind of break it down into 4 categories of testing. Number 1, can you navigate everywhere in your application? So one of the big issues that you'll often see when you're getting reports from users is they'll say, I can't get to place X. Like, I know this place exists in your app, but I can't get there. Navigation is often an issue. It usually means something isn't accessible that should be. Number 2, can you tap every tappable thing? So, maybe that's a like button or a favorite button, but if something is tappable, it should be tappable with VoiceOver running. Next, number 3, can you hear every bit of text? So if text is on the screen, VoiceOver should be able to get to it and read it. So, it just got romantic with the candles, like, wow. So can you hear every bit of text? So again, if there's text on the screen, you should be able to hear it. And lastly, can you hear every image? So if an image conveys any useful information whatsoever, whether it's an image for a button, maybe it's a graph, you should be able to voice that to to your user. So if you can get through these 4 things, your app is probably in a pretty darn good place. So what do you do once you find an issue? So there are two main issues. Back when I was working at Twitter and I would get accessibility tickets coming in every single day, there were kind of 2 things that would happen all the time. One would be the cursor simply wasn't finding something. It was on the screen, but that cursor just wouldn't select it, so the user couldn't get to it. That is usually an issue of is accessibility element. So this is a toggle that exists on any UI view, any accessibility element at all. And yes, it's a true or a false, yes or no. And often for things like a UI button, any UI control, that's going to be set to true automatically. But for things like just a plain old UI view, it won't be. And so if I've actually built my own button with a base level UI view, that's actually going to be set to no. I'm going to need to manually turn that on. And so oftentimes it would just be as simple as me going in, finding the custom view, setting is accessibility element to true, and that was it. The second category of issue that I saw all the time was the is something not speaking the correct name issue. So the cursor would get there and then VoiceOver would say something like image 7312848 PNG, like not helpful to the user at all. And that simply means that, of course, we haven't set a correct label on the thing. So for things like images, the VoiceOver system is going to pull the name from the file if it has no other information, or it'll use the asset name. So if you name your assets really well, that can sometimes save you if you forgot to actually give something an accessibility label. So generally, if it's not speaking the correct thing, this can be fixed by setting the correct accessibility label. Now, of course, this is very surface level, but I promise you this wasn't an API talk. But my point here is simply that 90% of the issues you get with accessibility are quite simple. They're usually just switching a bool or setting a label somewhere. And maybe it's not a label, maybe it's a value or some other accessibility info, but it's often as simple as setting a string or setting a bool. So why do we care about VoiceOver? This one's probably pretty obvious. Of course, VoiceOver is the key assistive technology for blind users or for severely visually impaired users. But additionally, users with motor control issues will often control their devices with something called a switch. A switch uses a cursor, and that cursor will scroll across the screen. It will either auto scroll or the user can move it manually. And when the user wants to activate something, they'll activate the switch. Now, because it's an issue with motor control, that can be by blowing into a tube. They might be able to move their head slightly to activate the switch. There's lots of different ways they can do it. Maybe the back of the hand is going to hit a button. But whatever the way they activate the switch is, the system generally works pretty similarly. Scrolling cursor and a yes, essentially, with a hit. And when you make something accessible to VoiceOver, because it's a cursor system as well, the switch will generally work pretty well too. So when I have a good VoiceOver supporting app, I generally have a good switch system supporting app. Finally, an app that is highly accessible benefits you and your company because it becomes highly automatable. So if you want to get into UI testing with automation and set up your device suite with automation running on it, that becomes much easier because automation frameworks are built on top of accessibility. That's actually how I got into accessibility, was working in automation first. So there you go. That's a quick tour of VoiceOver. Tip number 8, simplify. So pretty obvious tip. Generally simple, clear, easy to use UIs are better than Snapchat. They're better than confusing ones. At the last conference where I gave a similar talk, there was actually someone from Snapchat sitting right there, and I noticed it before the talk, so I changed it to Facebook Messenger. Yeah, true story. I'm really glad I saw him there. Anyway, hopefully none of you work at Snapchat. I'm so sorry if you do. It's a very confusing interface. Great app, confusing interface. But let's be more concrete. So in more concrete terms, UIs that favor navigation over putting everything on one screen generally avoid clutter and they avoid confusion. Also, UIs that keep the color scheme simple can avoid feeling unbalanced or incohesive or overwhelming. So if you ever used Visco, which did anyone here use Visco? Nah, darn. Okay, this example works so much better in America. But if you ever use Visco, it was this app that they created a joystick on your iPhone. So there was this dot in the middle, and you held your thumb over it. And then like where you moved your thumb was essentially kind of where you moved in the application. It was really creative, very interesting concept for UI. But obviously, like this was completely reinventing the wheel. And so it was very difficult for your users to learn. It pulled them away from the patterns they knew. And of course, it didn't really work well with any assistive technologies that were running on iOS devices. So message here is try, as fun as it can be to be like, I came up with the new UI pattern. Try not to do that. So simplicity favors those of all abilities. Those with learning disabilities can struggle, of course, with complex UIs. Also, complex UIs translate to very wordy voiceover. So if you think of your screen as it's a two-dimensional thing, or 3D now with 3D touch, but ignore that. It's a 2D thing. VoiceOver is essentially the 1D interface to your device because it's just a string. It's really just a string of text that's getting read. So if the screen reader just reads my screen from top to bottom, we're going from 2D to 1D. And to do that with a highly complex screen is going to take a long time, and it's going to take your VoiceOver user a long time to figure out whatever is happening on that screen. And finally, a highly complex screen is going to be challenging for anyone with motor issues. Touching the right place could be much more difficult when the right place could be almost anywhere. Simplicity also favors those of all ages. So people who are newer to technology, whether coming from the elderly side or the youth side, that's of course going to be a challenging place. And having a simple interface is going to help those users also use your applications. And again, too many colors can overwhelm. This is especially common. You'll see this with learning disabilities in particular. Having a lot of colors can become very distracting and make it hard for the user to find the content. So even if you think the content's right there, if there's a lot of color happening or a lot of animation, actually, that can pull users away from your content. It can also cause information loss because, of course, when we start thinking about visual disabilities of color blindness, if I'm using a ton of colors, but with certain disabilities, those colors may all blend together, I actually may lose information that you might think is important because two different colors look like one to somebody looking at your app. So lots of reasons to keep things simple. Continuing with that idea of simplicity, I wanted to make a separate point about gestures. Don't overdo it with gestures. So gestures can be great. They can make apps feel unique and fun and content focused when we don't have a lot of buttons on the screen. But there's a dark side to gestures. Gestures have to be discovered or taught. They require memorization. They often require additional dexterity beyond a simple tap. They frequently don't tell you if you did them wrong. So I might make if you have a custom check gesture, for example, if I don't do it correctly, did this screen not support it or did I do something wrong? It's hard to know. And of course, if you have custom gestures that are slightly different or unique, that's not going to be consistent in some other app. My application's not going to do what your application does. So I like to think of gestures as power user features. I'm not saying don't have them, but rather they're an extra thing for some users. So gestures should make things easier. They should help users save time, but there should also be a simpler way of doing the same thing. So the gesture way shouldn't be the only way. There should always be another pathway. And maybe that other pathway takes longer, but that's okay because the gesture's there for your power users. Another thing is that gestures should be forgiving. So I shouldn't be able to, delete all my emails without a confirm screen. So generally, I like to think of not triggering anything destructive from a simple gesture, always letting the user confirm that. Because of course, if I have some kind of a tremor with my hand, if I had too much caffeine even, and I do something I shouldn't do, I want to make sure I don't ruin my life. So why do we care so much about gestures? Well, we just saw some examples, but a few more specific ones for accessibility. VoiceOver itself is gesture driven. We saw that with Tommy. He was tapping, he was gesturing all over the place. And your gestures can end up conflicting with the VoiceOver ones, and that can become very confusing for VoiceOver users. So for example, with VoiceOver, a long press for you or I without VoiceOver running is a tap and then long press. And so there's multiple versions of gestures. If you start adding in your own gestures for those users, it can become quite complex. Complex gestures can also be hard to complete, of course, for anyone with tremors, any motor challenges at all. And as we talked about kind of the dark side of gestures, the learning curve and the memorization becomes particularly difficult if you do have some kind of a cognitive challenge. So again, gestures, I definitely think they can be great. They can be wonderful. Keep them in your app, but make sure there's other ways to do things. Finally, we're at the end. We're at tip number 10, and this is the most important one. If you ignore all the others, I think this is going to be the key. This is the key to any good product. Talk to and listen to your users. I like this comic a lot for this point, so I will read it to you. We interviewed hundreds of users and turned all of their suggestions into features. As it turns out, every user we talked to was an idiot, and their dumb suggestions ruined our product. In hindsight, we probably should have talked to people who work outside of this building. So what is this comic really saying? So often we don't have someone in-house who is blind or low vision or hard of hearing or has a motor impairment, or the list goes on and on. We don't, even if we have a few of those people, we don't generally have all of them. We tend to work at companies with very similar able-bodied, able-visioned people. And so especially in smaller companies, if we don't have people around us who are using assistive technologies, who are running their phones in grayscale, we just may not think of things. We may think of things in terms of us, and that's normal. But we want our users to think in terms of themselves. And so thankfully we have those users. And when there are issues, and if we're in communication with those users, they're going to reach out and they're going to help us help them. So one thing that was I've noticed with a lot of the bigger companies, and that we did at Twitter when I worked there as well, is that we had an accessibility account, and we ran that account, and users would reach out to it and they'd say, hey, like this button doesn't work or something's wrong. And half of the bug reports I got when I was at Twitter came through Twitter. Yes, at Twitter, and came through Twitter. So having things coming in through Twitter, coming in through email, whatever reaches you best, through Instagram, whatever it is. But users will make feature requests. They'll reach out and make bug reports. They'll offer feedback. And it's incredibly helpful to be able to be in communication with these users because they know what they need. And they help us understand how we can customize, improve, whatever it is we need to do to help our content reach them. So the moral of this story is make it easy for your users to reach you. Have a Twitter account, even if it's just your own account, make sure that they know they can reach out. And, bring your users in to, interview people if you can, anything you can do to get more information about what they need. Make it known that you care about accessibility. Use the hashtag A11Y for accessibility in your Twitter account or anywhere else that you're posting. All of these things, letting users know that they can reach you, they can talk to you, you want to hear their feedback, you want to work with them. Again, this one's obvious. We want our users to use our product. That's why we're making it. And our users, especially those with different abilities from us, are going to give us unique perspectives. And if our product isn't for all of our users who want to use it, then who is it for exactly? So that was it. Those were our 10 tips. So let's just run through them really quickly. Have high color contrast ratios. Use dynamic type and auto layout. Don't make people tap tiny things, and use standard UIKIT components whenever possible. Communicate dynamic information using multiple modes. Images are images and text is text. Test with VOICEOVER and simplify. Don't overdo it with gestures, and talk to and listen to your users. So in conclusion, making your apps more accessible does not require you to be an accessibility expert. Most of these tips didn't even involve accessibility APIs at all. They involve color contrast. They involve listening to people. They involve good UX. And of course, making your app more accessible benefits everyone. Simple interfaces, clean UI, easy to tap things, high color contrast. That benefits people with disabilities, but it benefits you. It benefits absolutely everybody. And finally, if nothing else, making your app accessible is the right thing to do. So please go ahead and do it. Thank you so much for your time. If you have questions, I'll be hanging out. I can take them, or you can reach me on Twitter at Sommer with an O, or you can take a picture of that thing. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Sommer, for a great talk. Now we should all make our apps more accessible, right?
Please.
So do you have any questions for Sommer? All right, one here from Farid.
Thank you for the talk. So the question I have may be related to accessibility, but I saw one of your slides that you had grayscale, and you said, okay, about contrast and such. I know that if you set your phone to grayscale, you will be less distracted, so you can be more focused. Do you have any other tips that could help us? I mean, like, we're the developers, but we know what it does to people.
So you want to be less distracted by your device?
Yes.
Uninstall Instagram. Uninstall Snapchat. That's a really interesting question. I've never ever gotten that question, how to be less distracted by your device. That's not necessarily, I see how it is related to accessibility, but it's a psychology question too. I don't think I have a direct answer, but let me think on it. The grayscale thing I have tried. It does definitely work. Instagram and Twitter is very boring in grayscale. But yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I have a brilliant answer, unfortunately.
One over here.
Any tips, ideas to help make an app accessible that's image heavy? For example, Instagram, I haven't tried it, but I imagine they read out usernames and comments and everything. But how about the images themselves?
It's such a good question. And this was probably one of the biggest challenges I ever faced when working at Twitter. Because obviously, similar to Instagram, users can add images. I think if I can paraphrase your question, what you're asking is when the users are providing the images, how do we make those images accessible? So different places have addressed this in different ways, and there are different philosophies on it. So Facebook, for example, they use AI, and they actually run facial detection, they run object detection over images, and they try to describe to the user what the images are. Twitter, on the other hand, what we went with was letting the users themselves add image descriptions. Actually, if you go in my Twitter feed and you turn on VoiceOver, you'll notice my images actually describe what they are. And that's because I actually add that information. And so users can add the information. I was like, ooh, what is that? Users can add the information themselves. So it's actually a very, very hard problem in the world of accessibility, because essentially it's like, how do you encourage users to provide accurate image descriptions? And also, then, if you're going to go the AI route, what do you do when the AI is wrong? So my answer to your question is that there isn't necessarily a good, a clear-cut way to do this. From the blind, or especially the visually impaired community and the blind community, what I've heard over and over is that they like that when every image has information. So the AI approach is great because it gives information to every image, but they also like that custom feeling with users adding info. And so kind of the best solution the dream solution I've heard from the blind community themselves is, do as much as you can automatically if possible, but then give users a chance to modify that information too. Of course, it's definitely challenging. One thing that I will say is if you're working with news agencies or other professional providers of content to your service, they're much more used to doing this, to providing alternative text for their images, and they will generally give you that if you ask. So that is one thing you can do if you're working with service or news groups, anything like that, is ask for alternative text and actually put that into the images. Is that kind of useful information? Okay. Is it going to be psychology? I actually have a bachelor's in psychology, but I didn't study that stuff.
So you mentioned that 7 to 12% of men have some level of color blindness. Do you have other figures that, as a developer, for example, yes, you can say we spend 1 hour and we can make that more accessible, but how do you convince business stakeholders who are very resistant? They just say, okay, you want to spend 2 hours, focus on this other feature.
Yeah.
Do you have some figures that could really show them that this helps the bottom line?
Yeah, so I have some links in the resources section of my slide, and those will have figures in them if you want to look up the actual numbers of like what percentage of people are blind, visually impaired. I don't have them memorized, but you can click on those links and you'll be able to find that from my talk. But often that data is not enough because truthfully, the percent of people who are blind and use applications isn't super high, right? If it were, I wouldn't have to give these talks. So generally that's, in my experience, that hasn't been enough to convince people to fight the accessibility fight, so to speak. One of the things, if you have a company that's very resistant to the idea of accessibility, sometimes the whole do the right thing argument doesn't work. And you know, it's a sad truth. Something that I've found more persuasive is the legal argument that there are more and more laws falling into place that require certain levels of accessibility. And especially if you have the kind of application that may be used by any government whatsoever, there are going to be even stricter laws about what has to be accessible. And that was something that was relatively persuasive at Twitter, was this idea of like, you know, there are, you know, government agencies that are posting information. If this is considered a news source, like it needs to be accessible. So the legal argument can sometimes work. Another argument has been really useful for me is automation. So often at bigger companies, they start talking about wanting to UI test, wanting to have UI automation testing. And so that's often a place where you can sell it and be like, listen, if the app is accessible, you're going to have to put way less work into this whole automation deal. So that can also be a selling point for companies that are a bit resistant. Another thing that I've actually found useful is bringing in users. Oftentimes, companies don't like if you're running a company, you haven't really interacted with users or seen how they use your product. Sometimes it can be that simple. That was one thing that I've done in places where I've consulted, is actually like brought in users, had them use the product in front of other people. And all of a sudden, what seems like this like philosophical argument becomes very concrete, and a little bit of human empathy kicks in. And they're like, oh my gosh, like here's someone struggling to use this thing that I want them to use. Like this isn't cool. So different things speak to different people: legal, automation, empathy, different approaches. And like I said, if you want numbers, those are definitely going to be in the links.
That was a great question.
Yeah, I've gotten some of these ones before.
Hey.
Hey.
Do you have any tips for apps UIs that may be more active, like more proactive than? So all the examples I saw there, I think were very, like it's the user consuming content. But for apps where the user may need to sort of observe, what's going on and react to things to get timings right, like more active, proactive apps, is that something that is achievable, like with the app sort of reading out what's going on all the time and notifying too much, or would that perhaps be something to skip? Or
it's definitely never something to skip. That's where you get into this kind of annoying answer where I'm going to say it depends on the application. So you can think of something like a game, like making some games accessible. If they're highly timing based, like that's going to be incredibly difficult and maybe even nearly impossible. But there is kind of a point where users also know their own abilities, and it's very unlikely someone who's fully visually impaired is going to try to play a game that clearly only relies upon vision. And so while I'm not going to say the words skip it, you can kind of, again, talk to your users. If your users say like, yeah, I would never try that, that kind of gives you an idea of how to price. But there's other things like maybe a music creation app. That's something that's very kind of proactive, right? Users creating the music, but it's also very sound based. And so that's something where you really want to think about it, and you do want to make it accessible. And there are a lot of other things that I didn't show today because we didn't do that API deep dive, but you make VoiceOver read things out. You can make VoiceOver, you can tell it whenever something changes on the screen and have it actually move the cursor to that thing. So there are definitely techniques for more of a kind of going out to the user approach to kind of push information forward. So I think the answer is it depends on what you're doing. And then yes, there are definitely ways to get VoiceOver reading things and pushing things to the user. Does that kind of answer your question a bit?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Cool.
All right, so maybe one last question, if somebody has one. Nope. All right, well then, thank you very much, Sommer.
Yeah, thank you all.